With 2020 keeping us all indoors, we took up other things and maybe you went to reading just like me. Hi folks, it's Mr. Henriquez, and in this video I'm going to discuss my 5 best books I've read in 2020. Now some of these books are not from 2020, but they're definitely good books I would recommend you to read at least once in your life. Now if you find this interesting, don't forget to like and subscribe, because some of these books I might discuss in detail in a different video, and it might be very useful for your exams, or maybe you need to write an essay on some of these books, so stay tuned for those videos. Let's get to it. Now the first book on this list is this one, Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, and I definitely recommend this book for the advanced learner of English. Now this book is on why we sleep and the importance of sleep for our health and our life. Now Matthew Walker is a neuroscientist who is specialized in sleep science, and he uses that knowledge of sleep science to discuss and describe why sleep is so important for our lives. Now, I used this book to change my sleeping pattern because I had some trouble sleeping in the beginning of 2020. And I think one of the best things I've learned in this book is why young people always tend to sleep late, and why they need to sleep in, and why most of them are always tired in class. You might recognize that from your own time in secondary school. What I like about this book is that he gives some very good recommendations of things you could do to improve your sleep. And I think that's why this book is definitely worth reading if your English is up to par and you're able to go through such a thick scientific book. Language-wise, the book is not that difficult, but it does require a very good understanding of English, otherwise you won't be able to get through the science part of the book. So I wouldn't recommend this book for young learners of English, but if you want a challenge and if you want to challenge yourself, this might be a very good book to read. Now the next book on my list is this one, The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. And this is definitely a book I would recommend you to read for school. Now, this book became very relevant and important during the Black Lives Matter movement of 2019. And I think it's still relevant today. The book follows Star, who witnesses how a police officer kills her friend Khalil while they're driving home from a party. And I think this book is very good for young people because it talks about something that we probably won't encounter in your life, especially not if you're from a white neighborhood. And the good thing about this book is that it follows Star throughout how she processes everything that happened after the shooting of Khalil. And besides that, it also deals with teenager things like her boyfriend and her family and her parents. So basically things that every teenager should be able to recognize themselves in. Another reason why I think this book is very relevant for teenagers is because it contains some references to things you might know, like for example the Fresh Prince of Bel-Air and music from Tupac, which is what the name is from. Language-wise, the book is not that difficult, and that's a good thing, because the book contains several concepts and ideas and historical figures you might want to research before reading on. And I think that's one of the good things of the book. Now it does include some African American vernacular English, and that's of course a variety of English that you don't know if you're not familiar with it. So that might be something you want to find out and research as well. Nevertheless, it's not that difficult to read and get through, and I think again this is a very good book for the average learner of English. As a teacher, I think this book fits perfectly well in a module on race and racism, and I think that's one of the reasons you should definitely give your students this book. Now, it's not a book that you should read for a test or something. It really asks that you go and dive deeper into what this book discusses. Now, I had my students do lots of research projects using this book, and I think it's a very good book to do that. Mostly because the language is not that difficult, but also because there are several things that students just must know, like Dr. Martin Luther King and the Black Panther movement. Now, if you're here because you didn't read this book and you want me to talk about what it is, I'm not going to do that. But I have one very important tip for you. Do not watch the film. There are some significant differences between book and film, and I think the book is better than the film. Now ask your parents or grandparents which book you should read for school, and they'll probably recommend something like 1984 by George Orwell. This 1948 classic is definitely the king of dystopian novels, and I would definitely recommend everyone to read this at least once in your life. 1984 is about Winston Smith, a worker in the governing party of Oceania in London. The world is divided into 3 so-called superstates: Oceania, Eurasia and East Asia. And the goal of each of these superstates is to have war. They're in a continuing, ongoing war that will never stop. And in this book, we follow Winston Smith and how he copes with the world he lives in and how he rebels against these elites and this governing party. And he even manages to get into a relationship with someone called Julia. Now, I won't go into details because I really think you should read this book for yourself, but there are some things I want to point out. Now, this book is marvelous because it contains some twists and turns that you probably won't expect. Now, it is tricky because you need some understanding of politics and some understanding of socialism to get through the book. But after reading this book, I was finally able to understand all these 1984 references people make. Most of them are incorrect because they haven't read the book. And, you probably know this book from the phrase Big Brother is watching you, and you finally can understand what it means to have something like Big Brother watching you. And to be honest, it's nothing like Facebook and Google are doing now. Language-wise, this book is difficult, and it uses a lot of difficult words, to be honest, and you need a good dictionary to get through the book. But I think if you have the right dedication and if you have the right dictionary, you can easily get through the book if you have something like an audiobook as well. I would definitely recommend reading a summary before reading this book. Don't read the entire summary, otherwise you might spoil the book and spoil the fun of reading. But having a summary to get started, to get at least the basics of the world into your head, will definitely help you while reading this book. Now, number 2 on my list you might know from the HBO series of the same name, The Handmaid's Tale. And I think honestly, this is the most frightening book I've read in 2020. And I've read some horror books, and even though this is not a horror story, it is definitely very scary. And the reason I find it scary is because, the things that happen in this book can actually take place because of how strongly religious the people in this book are. The Handmaid's Tale follows Offred, a woman whose goal is to harvest as many children as possible because she is one of the few fertile women left, which means that she can have children. Now, since that's her only goal, she doesn't have a lot of freedom because she's allowed to go to the shop, she's allowed to speak with one person, and she has to attend these compulsory Bible readings and prayer sessions. Now, in the book, we read how the United States of America got from where they are now, right, a land of the free, to what they are in this so-called Republic of Gilead. Now, the best part of this book is the final chapter, in which we read how a lecturer found this book, which is basically Offred's diary, and he did some research on finding out really what happened in this time of the world. And he fills in some gaps that Offred leaves open, and it gives a bit more context of the world that these women live in. And I think that's very good, that's very strong. It's a very nice way to end the book. In line with 1984, this is definitely a book I would recommend for your final year of secondary school. Now, it does talk about sex and rape, and that is something you really need to take into account. But the book contains a lot of layers, so if you're a very focused reader, I think you'll feel at home in this book. It contains many things you can talk about in essays, in exams, in oral exams, and I think that's why this is a very good book to read for school. Now, if I were your teacher and I've had the time, I would give my students both of these books and ask them to write a compare and contrast essay between these two dystopian worlds. I think that would be a very good assignment. Language-wise, this book is not as difficult as 1984, and the language is more modern and way more poetic than 1984. Now, she does go into detail in some scenes, for example in Offred's room, but I think that's very relevant because she discusses things that we might take for granted now that Offred cannot take for granted in her world. Now, my number 1 is, I think, the best book I've ever read, and it's very important for 2020. 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson. Now, why I found this book so useful in 2020 is because of coronavirus, everything we know went into chaos, and this book really tries to give us an antidote to chaos. Now, it's not from 2020, it's from earlier, but I think it's very applicable to everything that happened in 2020 as well. Peterson gives 12 rules for life, or guidelines if you like, that he follows. He backs them up with examples from his own life or explanations which justify why these rules are relevant. He refers to ancient scripts and texts and religious texts to show that most of these rules have been in society for ages, and that's what makes it so relevant. Now, the strong part of this book is that it really makes you think of your own life and your own place in the world. Take for example the first rule, stand up straight with your shoulders back. And he uses lobsters to explain how certain hormones in our brains and in lobsters' brains portray their self-image and how this influences the way these lobsters look at themselves and how these lobsters behave in fights. And he tries to put the same in our human brains, right? He tries to make a link between what happens in lobsters' brain with what happens in human brains and says, well, you know, we need to stand up straight with our shoulders back because then we feel like people who are worth being alive and who are worth standing straight with their shoulders back. Now the second rule is the one I like the most. Treat yourself like you are someone you are responsible for helping, which basically means take care of yourself. Now this book is sometimes criticized for being too conservative, and as a conservative myself I don't really mind. But even if you're not a conservative, I think this book is very useful for you. Because there might be things in this book that are applicable to your own life and that you might find very useful. Now I think this book is relevant for everyone between the ages 18 to 30, but even 30 plus might find this book very relevant. Now this is not meant for younger learners or younger readers, right? So if you're below 18, I would definitely not recommend reading this book. But it is very useful and it is very good when you turn 18 to have a book like this to help you get started in this world filled with chaos. Now language-wise, again, it is very difficult. So even for the new English learner, I would not recommend reading this book because it is very scientific and it refers to some concepts that are very abstract and you need to have the language basis to be able to understand those concepts. It talks about the Bible a lot, so having some Bible knowledge and biblical knowledge will definitely help you get through the book quicker. But, you know, I had to pause the audiobook while listening and, you know, pause the reading because I had to make some notes and write things down and put sticky notes, as you can see. So this is really definitely my top book of 2020. Now, the new book is the sequel to this book, Beyond Order, 12 More Rules for Life. This comes out in 2021 and I think that will definitely be on my top 5 next year, but who knows, we'll see what happens. And that's basically it. This is my top 5 books I've read in 2020. Now, I look forward to reading more in 2021 and I hope I've inspired you to read some more as well. Maybe you will read one of these books or maybe one of your own. Let me know in the comments, which books are you aiming to read for in 2021? Don't forget to like this video. If you like this video, also subscribe. I am going to go into more detail in some of these books in my next videos, and maybe that might be useful for one of your exams or essays or oral exams, or even if you're one of my students, I might ask you to read one of these books for your next test. For now, I wish you the best in 2021. I hope you can forget 2020 as quickly as possible because of the coronavirus, and I hope 2021 will be an amazing year with lots of new experiences. And I hope to see you then as well.